Well, hello. This is a portion of the Stuart Braga collection, and this is a collection of books on Australian political leaders. Most of them are biographies, and I start late in the 19th century with Henry Parkes, moving forward not all but many of the Australian Prime Ministers and a few other political leaders right up to John Howard in the early 21st century. Of the 39 items here, 10 are signed by either the author or the subject of the biography. The collection, in fact, represents my keen interest in biography, and hence there is almost nothing on political history of the 20th century Australian scene as such. I do have some others, but this is close to being a coherent collection of those books. So Parkes is represented by Professor A. W. Martin's excellent biography right at the beginning. I move to the two great political leaders before World War I, and that of course is Barton, the first Prime Minister, and Alfred Deakin, one of the great Federation founders. A superb biography published in the mid-1960s. This is book publishing of the 1960s, Melbourne University Press at its finest, John Larno's. I move then to Billy Hughes, but I'm going to come back to him because he is certainly the most controversial and written about and spoken about Australian political leader until Gough Whitlam, and he is represented not here but in another collection which David already has. So moving past Billy Hughes, we come to again an almost complete collection from Scullin and Curtin. There are a few omitted because when I began collecting these, there were a few gaps in well-recognised biographies of Australian politicians. Thus, there is nothing on Joe Lyons. I then resume with Sir Robert Menzies. One of these is signed. This one. It's a measure of the years. It shows Menzies in the robes of the Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, an ancient English title. And that is signed for Winton Salisbury, with good wishes, Robert Menzies, 1970. That's the only Menzies volume that is signed. Others include things by Menzies, of which the most important is Central Power in the Australian Commonwealth. There's even the wit of Sir Robert Menzies. The most important books here are probably a very fine gesture written by Sir Percy Josky, who knew Menzies well and was in his cabinet. I don't much like his choice of portrait. A better study by Sir Paul's Haddock, a brief pamphlet, shows a very fine photograph of Menzies. The most important books on Menzies are the two-volume biography by, again, Professor A. W. Martin, Robert Menzies, A Life. A very, very good biography. It doesn't try to be too compendious. This is another signed book by Sir Arthur Fadden, and it's a whimsical view. As you can see, they called me Artie, and here it is signed to Sir Lionel. I don't know who that was. Sir Lionel, your interest is appreciated. With warm regards, A. Fadden, Artie, February 4, 1970. After the downfall of Menzies in 1941, it was thought to be the end of his political career. Of course, that wasn't the case. You had other people coming to the fore then. The first of them, briefly, Sir Earl Page, who had been the leader of the Country Party from the mid-1920s until his death, and his autobiography, very whimsically, Truant Surgeon, which has some most entertaining accounts of early motoring in the northern rivers of New South Wales, where he was a country doctor and then became the federal member. David Day was the official biographer of two prime ministers. First, big books, two very important biographies. The first is John Curtin, and the second is Ben Chifley. Now, Dave writes, it's almost hagiography. David writes as a Labour Party member and apologist. Very good books indeed, but they represent a strongly pro-Labour bias, as one might guess. There is a book by Larry Fitzharding. This is by Crisp on Ben Chifley, which I think is a better book. We turn to Malcolm Fraser. And this is signed by Malcolm Fraser to Mr. Braga. Malcolm Fraser. It has a most interesting frontispiece. And it shows Fraser, a tiny, tiny figure here, and he's addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. A moment of power for Fraser.
How did you get Malcolm Fraser's signature on that, Ted?
Now, how I got that signature was that he came to Trinity to speak to an economics group run by Ian Moore. So I wrote a note, Trinity note paper, which reads, "Dear Mr. Fraser, your kindness in autographing this copy of Philippe's biography would be greatly appreciated. Stuart Braga, Senior Master, Trinity Grammar School." I didn't in fact meet him that day. He came and spoke and then left fairly quickly afterwards. We turn to Bob Hawke. Now, Bob Hawke, his memoirs, he signed it to Eddie, best wishes, Bob Hawke. So they're his own memoirs.
So you don't know who Eddie was?
No idea. And his biography by Blanche Delpuget, his second wife. He simply signed it, Bob Hawke. Other copies of these books exist with labels that he signed in a bookshop, probably 100 labels, which then stuck inside a book, and I would never buy a book quite like that. Now, this is David Barnett with Prue Goward, who was later a minister in his government, John Howard Prime Minister. In several books I don't have his Lazarus Rising, his own autobiography, but this one is signed to Stuart Braga from John Howard. Now, the circumstances here is that I took the book to Orange for the launch of Anzac Doctor, and I was the lead speaker in the VC centenary dinner in the year 2000. I had this with me, and at one of the functions I had the book. I could see Mr. Howard's minders there and asked permission to go past them, tapped Mr. Howard on the shoulder. He looked at my name badge very carefully and signed the book, and I was very pleased that he did. He in fact is the last Prime Minister that I've got here. I do not have any book about Paul Keating. He in fact is the gap at this point, and John Howard is the last of the series. They're turned to a few additional ones. Bill Hayden. Now, all of these next ones are Governors General as well as politicians. Now, Bill Hayden has simply signed this, Bill Hayden. Now, I don't know the circumstances at all. Bill Hayden, who had a somewhat scratchy relationship with various Prime Ministers, as did Paul Hasluck, but not so much in office. In the House of Representatives, he certainly did. Hasluck said to Whitlam, before Whitlam became Prime Minister, while Hasluck was still in Parliament, Hasluck said to Whitlam, "You are the worst thing that's ever come into this House." Whitlam was holding a glass of water and threw it in Hasluck's face. As Prime Minister and Governor General, apparently they got on perfectly well by being very correct in their roles. It's the only time in the House of Representatives that water has been thrown. The newspaper headlines next morning were entertaining. Whitlam proves he can't hold his water. There's another one by Hasluck, not signed. Diplomatic witness, Paul Hasluck. He was one of the early and important figures in Australian foreign affairs. Lastly, not signed either, Lord Casey, who was eminent in Australian affairs from the First World War on. He was on Gallipoli, then entered politics quite young, and later became Governor-General, and is one of only very few Australian politicians to be elevated to the peerage. The story goes that he turned up to take his seat at the House of the Lords, and he signed himself R.G. Casey, and the attendants looked absolutely horrified. He should only have used his title, Lord Casey. So there are 3 Governors-General, and the last few items here are both by a most entertaining man. They're both signed, Fred Daly, and one is a whimsical set of memoirs, Fred Daly, the politician who laughed, the other one a little paperback from Curtain to Hawk. And Fred Daly has signed it. Simply Fred Daly. He has a wonderful story. Early in his political career, at an election, he was seeking re-election, and his opponents had a slogan which was on posters around the electorate: be decent, be clean, change daily. Daly was up to it. He put up other posters, and the poster he wrote had, "Give us this day our daily Fred." So that's the conclusion of this interview, and later we'll deal with Billy Hughes. Thank you, David.